A group of cocky teenage boys thought it'd be funny to bully an old black man on the bus, mocking his age, testing his patience, and pushing their luck. But they had no idea who they were messing with. This man wasn't just any elder, he was a retired martial arts instructor with a lifetime of discipline and strength behind his calm gaze. What happened next? They got a lesson in respect they'll never forget. The air inside the city bus was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and the faint tang of wet coats. It was a dreary Thursday afternoon in Lisbon, Portugal, the kind where the sky hung low with gray clouds and the cobblestone streets glistened from a morning drizzle. The number 728 bus rattled along its route through the narrow streets of Alfama, the oldest district in the city, its engine groaning as it climbed the steep hills. Inside, the passengers sat in their own worlds, some staring out the streaked windows, others scrolling on their phones, all swaying slightly with the bus's uneven rhythm. Near the back, 4 teenage boys sprawled across the seats, their laughter cutting through the hum of the engine. They were loud, brash, and restless, their school uniforms wrinkled and untucked after a long day. Miguel, the tallest of the group, with a mop of dark curls, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, smirking as he scanned the bus for something, or someone, to entertain them. Beside him, João, wiry and sharp-eyed, chewed gum loudly, popping bubbles with a grin. The other two, Pedro and André, slouched lower, egging each other on with snickers and whispered jabs. Their eyes landed on an old black man sitting alone near the middle of the bus. He was tall, even seated, with broad shoulders that hinted at a strength long faded, or so they assumed. His hair was a tight crop of gray curls, and his face bore deep lines, etched by time and experience. He wore a faded navy coat, the kind you might find in a thrift shop, and his hands rested calmly on a wooden cane propped between his knees. To the boys, he looked like an easy target, old, quiet, out of place in their world. "Hey, Avo," Miguel called out, his voice dripping with mock respect. "Grandpa, you lost or something? This isn't the nursing home bus." The other boys burst into laughter, João slapping the seat in front of him. The old man didn't react, his gaze fixed on the window as the city blurred past. His silence only fueled their boldness. "What's wrong, Velo?" João chimed in, leaning over the aisle. "Too tired to talk? Those old bones creaking yet?" Pedro, the smallest of the group, pulled out his phone and started filming, giggling as he zoomed in on the man's weathered hands gripping the cane. "Look at this guy. Bet he's been riding this bus since the dinosaurs." The taunts grew louder, drawing a few uneasy glances from other passengers. A woman in a red scarf shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. A young man with earbuds pulled them out, frowning, though he quickly looked away when Miguel shot him a glare. The boys were a pack now, feeding off each other's energy, testing how far they could push. The old man turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Miguel's eyes. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but there was a flicker of something sharp and steady, that made Miguel pause for a split second. Then he shook it off, leaning closer. "What's that look for, huh? You got something to say? Or you just gonna sit there like a statue?" Miguel sneered. "Maybe you're scared. Old man like you, all alone." The bus lurched to a stop at Praça do Comércio, the wide plaza opening up to the Tagus River. The doors hissed open, and the old man rose slowly, gripping his cane. He didn't say a word as he stepped into the aisle, his movements deliberate but smooth, betraying none of the frailty the boys had mocked. As he passed them, André stuck out a foot, trying to trip him. The man sidestepped it without breaking stride, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. "Come on, let's follow him," Joao whispered, a glint in his eye. He thinks he's tough? Let's see how tough he really is. The boys piled out after him, their laughter echoing across the plaza as the bus pulled away. The old man walked toward the riverfront, his pace steady, the cane clicking against the wet stone. The drizzle had stopped, but the air was cool and damp, the sky a heavy slate above them. Tourists milled about, snapping photos of the golden Arc de Triomphe, but the boys had eyes only for their target. They trailed him, keeping just enough distance to feel clever. Miguel shoved his hands in his pockets, mimicking the man's walk with exaggerated slowness. Look at him, waddling along. Bet he's got nowhere to go. Maybe he's homeless, Pedro said, still filming. Hey, Avo, you got any change for us? The man stopped near a bench overlooking the water. He turned, facing them fully for the first time, and the boys faltered. Up close, his presence was different. Taller, broader, more solid than they'd expected. His eyes were dark and piercing, cutting through their bravado like a blade. For a moment they hesitated, but Joao recovered first, stepping forward with a smirk. What's your problem, huh? You don't belong here acting all high and mighty. Go back where you came from. The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. It wasn't just about his age anymore. It never really had been. The boys didn't know where he was from, didn't care. To them, his skin was enough to mark him as an outsider, a stranger in their city, their world. Racism wasn't a word they'd use to describe it. It was just how things were. A reflex they'd picked up from muttered conversations at home, from the glances of strangers, from the cracks in a society that prided itself on progress, but still carried old wounds. The old man tilted his head slightly, as if weighing them. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying a faint accent. Maybe West African, maybe something else. You boys should go home. This doesn't end well for you. Miguel laughed, but it sounded forced. Oh yeah? What are you gonna do, hit us with your stick? The man didn't answer. He turned and started walking again, heading toward a quieter stretch of the waterfront where the crowds thinned out. The boys exchanged looks, their excitement tinged with something else now. Anger, maybe, or the need to prove something. They followed, their footsteps quickening. They didn't know it yet, but they'd just lit the fuse. The waterfront grew quieter as the old man led them away from the bustling plaza. The Tagus River lapped against the stone embankment, its dark waters reflecting the muted gray of the sky. The boys' voices bounced off the damp pavement, their taunts growing sharper, more reckless. They were a pack now, fully committed, the thrill of the chase drowning out any flicker of doubt. Joao picked up a pebble and tossed it, watching it skitter past the old man's feet. Hey, Evo, you deaf too? Or just slow? The others laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. The man hadn't flinched, hadn't sped up or slowed down, just kept walking, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. He turned down a narrow side street, one of those winding alleys Alfama was famous for, where the buildings leaned close and the light barely reached the ground. Laundry hung limp on sagging lines above, and the air smelled faintly of salt and old stone. The boys hesitated at the mouth of the alley, glancing at each other. It was darker here, more isolated. But Miguel squared his shoulders, his pride outweighing his unease. Come on, he muttered. He's not getting away that easy. They followed, their footsteps echoing in the tight space. The old man stopped halfway down the alley, near a rusted metal bench tucked against the wall. He turned to face them again, his coat swaying slightly in the breeze. The cane rested lightly in his hand. Not a crutch, but an extension of him, its polished wood catching the faint light. You've had your fun, he said, his voice cutting through their chatter like a knife. Go home. The boys froze, caught off guard by the authority in his tone. For a moment they might have listened, might have turned back, laughed it off, gone to grab a soda and forget the whole thing. But João, always the boldest, stepped forward, his chest puffed out. Or what? He snapped. You gonna cry about it, old man? Tell your mommy? Miguel smirked, feeding off João's energy. Yeah, what are you gonna do, yell at us in whatever language you speak back home? The old man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he shifted his stance. Just a slight adjustment. Feet planted wider, shoulders squared. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it changed everything. The boys didn't notice. They were too busy laughing, too caught up in their own game. Andre, still filming, zoomed in on the man's face. Say something for the camera, Avo. Tell us how scared you are. The old man sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. Last chance, he said quietly. That was it. The line crossed. João lunged forward, not with a punch but a shove, aiming to knock the man off balance, to prove who was in charge. It happened fast, too fast for the others to process. The old man moved, fluid, precise, like water slipping through fingers. His cane flicked up, catching João's wrist mid-motion, twisting it just enough to throw him off. João stumbled, yelping as he hit the ground, his gum flying out of his mouth. What the hell? Miguel shouted, rushing forward. He swung a wild fist, all teenage bravado and no technique. The old man sidestepped, the cane darting out again, not to strike, but to redirect. Miguel's momentum carried him into the wall, his shoulder slamming against the stone with a dull thud. He cursed, clutching it as he spun around. Pedro and Andre backed up, eyes wide, their laughter gone. João scrambled to his feet, red-faced and furious. You're dead, old man! He yelled, charging again. This time the man didn't hold back. He dropped the cane, it clattered to the ground, and caught João's arm, twisting it behind his back in one smooth motion. With a gentle but firm push, he sent João sprawling face first into the bench, pinning him there with a knee just light enough not to bruise. Stay down, the man said, his voice calm but unyielding. Miguel roared, launching himself at the man's back. It was a mistake. The old man pivoted, grabbing Miguel's jacket and using his own weight against him. In a blur, Miguel was on the ground beside João, gasping as the air rushed out of his lungs. The whole thing took seconds, controlled, efficient, no wasted movement. Pedro dropped his phone, hands shaking. Andre just stood there, mouth open, the camera forgotten. The alley was silent now, save for the boys' ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city. The old man straightened, picking up his cane with the same deliberate care he'd shown all along. He looked at them, not with anger or triumph, but something closer to disappointment. You don't know what strength is, he said. You think it's this, pushing people around, making noise. It's not. João groaned, rolling onto his side, his pride more bruised than his body. Miguel glared up at him, but the fire in his eyes was flickering. They were beaten, not broken, not bloodied, but humbled in a way they hadn't expected. The man stepped back, giving them space. Get up, go home, think about why you're here. And then he turned, walking away down the alley, his silhouette fading into the shadows. The boys didn't move at first. They stayed there, sprawled or slumped, the damp chill of the alley seeping into their bones. João rubbed his wrist, wincing. Miguel sat against the wall, staring at the ground, his jaw tight. Pedro fumbled for his phone. The screen cracked but still recording, a silent witness to their defeat. Andre just looked lost, like a kid who'd wandered too far from home. What? What just happened? Pedro whispered, his voice small. He's some kind of freak, João muttered, but it lacked conviction. He spat on the ground, trying to reclaim some dignity. Old bastard got lucky. Lucky? Miguel snapped, his voice hoarse. He took us down like we were nothing. You see how he moved? They didn't want to admit it, not out loud, not yet, but they'd felt it. The gap between them and him, vast and humbling. It wasn't just skill, it was something deeper, a quiet power they couldn't touch, and beneath their anger, beneath the sting of their egos, a question gnawed at them. Who was he? They got up slowly, brushing off their clothes, avoiding each other's eyes. The alley felt smaller now, the walls closer. They trudged back to the waterfront, the city coming alive around them. Tourists laughing, street musicians strumming fado tunes, the river flowing on like nothing had changed. But for them, something had. That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He lay in his cramped bedroom, the glow of his phone lighting up the peeling paint on the ceiling. He kept replaying it, the way the old man had moved, the weight of his words. You don't know what strength is. It stung more than the ache in his shoulder. He thought about his dad, who'd always said respect came from fear, from being the loudest in the room. He thought about the stories he'd heard, the ones that made it okay to look down on someone like that old man. For the first time, they didn't sit right. João, meanwhile, told a different story. By Monday, he'd spun it into a tale of how they'd almost taken the guy, how he'd cheated with some trick cane. The others let him talk, but they didn't join in. Pedro deleted the video, said it wasn't worth keeping. Andre just stayed quiet, his usual chatter gone. Weeks passed, and the old man became a ghost in their minds, a shadow they couldn't shake. Then one day, Miguel saw him again. It was at a small gym near Bairro Alto, a place he'd passed 100 times but never noticed. The man was there, not in his coat, but a plain t-shirt, showing arms still corded with muscle despite his age. He was teaching a class. Kids, teens, adults, all listening like he was some kind of sage. Miguel stood outside, watching through the window, unnoticed. The old man's name was Samuel, he learned later, a retired martial arts coach from Cape Verde, decades spent mastering capoeira, judo, and more. He'd come to Lisbon years ago, built a life, trained fighters who'd gone on to championships. But he didn't flaunt it. He didn't need to. Miguel didn't tell the others. He didn't sign up for the class either. Not yet. But he started walking by more often, watching, thinking. The world felt bigger now, messier. He wondered what else he'd gotten wrong. Back on the 728 bus, life rolled on. The seats filled with new faces, new stories. Samuel wrote it sometimes, cane in hand, eyes on the city he'd made his own. The boys had their lesson, but what they did with it was theirs to choose. Some lessons fade, some sink deep. For them, the road was still open, rough, uncertain, but theirs. And somewhere in Lisbon, an old man smiled, knowing he'd planted a seed.